The strangest thing about living with a poodle isn't how smart they are. It's how impossible they are to emotionally escape. At first, it feels flattering. Almost beautiful. You walk into a room, and before you even speak, the dog is already looking at you. Not casually. Not the distracted glance most dogs give before going back to sleep. A poodle watches. Quietly. Constantly. You stand up for water at 2 a.m. And somewhere in the darkness, they lift their head. You sigh after reading a message on your phone, and suddenly they're staring at your face like they heard something you didn't say out loud. And after enough months living with them, some owners begin describing a strange feeling they never expected to have around a dog. Not companionship. Observation. Because poodles don't just follow movement. They study emotional atmosphere. Tiny changes in tone. Silence. Tension. Distance. They learn your routines so deeply that eventually it stops feeling like the dog is living with you. And starts feeling like the dog is living inside your emotional rhythm. That's the part nobody warns people about. Highly intelligent dogs don't just understand commands better. Sometimes, they attach harder. Deeper. In ways that slowly become psychologically exhausting. And what feels like love at first, can slowly start feeling like surveillance. But the claustrophobic feeling doesn't begin with anxiety. It begins with something that feels almost magical. There's a reason people describe poodles more like emotionally intelligent roommates than dogs. Living with one can feel strangely personal from the very beginning. Not because they perform tricks. Not because they're obedient. But because they react to emotions with an intensity that feels almost unsettlingly human. A poodle doesn't just notice when you're upset. They often notice before the people around you do. The shift in your breathing. The tension in your shoulders. The way your footsteps sound slightly heavier after a difficult day. Somehow, they recalibrate themselves around it almost instantly. If the house becomes loud, they become careful. If you become quiet, they move closer. If your routine changes, they start watching you more intensely, as if trying to solve a problem they can feel but don't fully understand. And over time, owners begin responding to that sensitivity in ways they rarely expect. They start talking to them. Not casually. Emotionally. Confiding in them after arguments. Sitting beside them during panic attacks. Looking into their faces during moments of loneliness because the dog appears to be doing something profoundly human. Listening. Science helps explain part of this. Highly social working breeds evolve to become unusually cooperative with humans, constantly monitoring body language, facial expression, eye direction, and vocal tone. But with poodles, that social intelligence combines with extraordinary pattern recognition and emotional sensitivity. The result is a dog that often appears emotionally synchronized with its owner. And that illusion becomes incredibly powerful. Because once an animal starts feeling emotionally responsive enough, the human brain stops treating the relationship like simple pet ownership. The dog slowly becomes part of the process of emotional regulation itself. A source of comfort. Stability. Routine. Safety. Sometimes, it's even emotional survival. Which is why separation from them can start feeling strangely wrong. Bigger than people expect. Almost physical. And that's exactly where the problem starts, because once a dog becomes part of your emotional nervous system, distance starts to feel impossible. Most owners don't notice the shift until one small realization hits them out of nowhere. They haven't been physically alone in months. Not truly. Because by that point, the poodle has quietly inserted itself into nearly every corner of daily life. You walk into the kitchen, they follow. You stand up from the couch, they immediately lift their head. You close a door, and seconds later there's silence on the other side, followed by the soft sound of paws stopping directly outside. At first it feels affectionate. Loyal, even. But repetition changes the emotional texture of things. The constant following stops feeling cute when it never turns off. Some owners begin noticing they unconsciously narrate their movements to the dog. reassuring them before leaving the room, avoiding certain routines that trigger visible distress, timing errands around the dog's anxiety, delaying trips, canceling plans, leaving televisions on for comfort. Tiny adjustments, tiny emotional negotiations, over and over again. And the poodle notices every single one. That's what makes highly intelligent dogs different. They don't just experience behavioral patterns. They reinforce them rapidly. If anxiety earns reassurance, they remember. If following behavior creates closeness, they repeat it. If emotional attentiveness strengthens the bond, the attentiveness intensifies. So the attachment deepens quietly, almost invisibly. The dog starts monitoring not just your movements, but your emotional state itself. A heavier sigh changes their behavior. A stressful phone call pulls them closer. An argument in another room suddenly makes them restless and alert, pacing between people like they're trying to stabilize something emotionally unstable inside the house. And without realizing it, many owners begin emotionally mirroring the dog back. An anxious owner creates a more attached poodle. A more attached poodle creates an even more emotionally dependent environment. Until eventually, the relationship starts feeding itself. That's why some owners describe living with poodles less like owning a pet, and more like constantly managing an emotional observer who never fully relaxes. Even the staring changes over time. In the beginning, it feels intelligent. Then attentive. Then strangely intense. Because poodles don't stare randomly. They stare when they're trying to read you. Anticipate you. Understand what emotional version of you is about to appear next. And eventually, some people begin feeling emotionally exposed inside their own homes. But even that still feels manageable. Until the poodle starts reacting to emotions you never intended to show. Many poodle owners describe the same strange moment. The dog reacts before anyone else realizes something is wrong. Before voices rise during an argument, the poodle is already watching the room differently. More alert. More rigid. Moving cautiously between people like tension itself has become visible to them. Before tears appear, they move closer. Before panic fully surfaces, they start pacing. And after enough experiences like that, the relationship begins feeling emotionally uncanny. Because eventually, owners stop asking, "Why is my dog so attached?" and start asking something much stranger. How did they know? Part of the answer is biological. Dogs are extraordinarily sensitive to subtle behavioral shifts humans barely notice consciously. Tiny posture changes. Breathing rhythm. Eye movement. Facial tension. Vocal frequency changes that happen long before obvious emotional expression appears. Even stress hormones can alter scent patterns in ways dogs detect almost instantly. But with poodles, the sensitivity often feels amplified by their constant observation. They are always collecting information. Always monitoring. Always emotionally checking the environment for changes. A stressful day doesn't stay private for long around them. You walk through the front door, pretending everything is fine, and suddenly they won't stop following you. You sit quietly hoping to suppress anxiety, and now they're staring directly into your face from across the room. Some will repeatedly nudge hands, paw at legs, or position themselves physically against the owner as if trying to interrupt emotions they can sense building internally. And this is where the emotional experience becomes deeply complicated. Because on one hand, it feels comforting. Profoundly comforting. The idea that another living creature understands your pain before you say a word can feel almost healing during loneliness or emotional exhaustion. But constant emotional attention has another side. It can start feeling invasive. Some owners quietly admit they stop masking emotions around the dog because hiding them feels pointless anyway. Others begin feeling overwhelmed by the relentless emotional awareness directed toward them every day. No emotional withdrawal. No true privacy. Just constant sensitivity. Constant checking. Constant emotional presence. And the terrifying part isn't that the poodle understands your emotions. It's how quickly your entire emotional life starts reorganizing around theirs. You begin regulating your stress to avoid upsetting the dog. You soften arguments. Suppress frustration. Change routines. Monitor departures more carefully. Even your own sadness starts carrying an additional emotional burden now, because the moment you feel unstable, the dog destabilizes too. That's when the relationship crosses an invisible line. The owner is no longer simply caring for the dog emotionally. They're managing the dog's emotional response to their own emotional state. And once that loop locks into place, leaving the dog alone can start to feel psychologically unbearable. Some poodle owners stop making plans entirely. Not because the dog physically stops them, but because of what waiting at home feels like. At a certain point, departures stop feeling simple. You grab your keys, and before the door even opens, the poodle is already watching you differently. Their body stiffens. Their eyes lock onto small routines they've memorized with terrifying precision. Shoes. Jacket. Bag. Door handle. And suddenly the entire emotional atmosphere changes. Some dogs begin pacing immediately. Others whine softly, following room to room with rising urgency as if trying to interrupt the sequence before it finishes. Highly bonded poodles can become so emotionally dependent on proximity and reassurance that even short absences start triggering panic behaviors. Barking. Scratching doors. Destroying objects carrying the owner's scent. Endless pacing through empty rooms. But what slowly exhausts people isn't only the behavior itself. It's the anticipation of it. Owners begin leaving the house already imagining the distress unfolding behind them. Sitting in restaurants checking cameras. Rushing through conversations. Avoiding overnight trips. Cutting evenings short because somewhere in the back of their mind, the dog is waiting. Or worse. Panicking. And guilt changes human behavior faster than almost anything else. That's the dangerous loop. The more distressed the dog becomes during separation, the more reassurance the owner gives before leaving. Longer goodbyes. Softer voices. Extra affection. Repeated comforting rituals designed to reduce anxiety. But often, those rituals accidentally intensify the emotional significance of separation itself. So the dependency deepens quietly again. The dog becomes hyper-aware of departures. The owner becomes hyper-aware of the dog's emotional reactions. And eventually, daily life starts reorganizing around emotional management. Not companionship. Management. Some owners describe feeling emotionally trapped by their own empathy. They love the dog deeply, but the relationship no longer feels emotionally spacious. Every outing carries guilt. Every return home feels loaded with responsibility. Even moments of independence begin feeling selfish. That's what emotional claustrophobia really is. Not a lack of love, but love without emotional space. A bond so emotionally intertwined that simple distance starts feeling psychologically wrong to both sides. And because poodles are so intelligent, so observant, and so emotionally responsive, they often reinforce that cycle faster than owners realize. Until eventually, the house itself starts emotionally revolving around the dog's nervous system. But the most psychologically exhausting part isn't the dependency itself. It's what happens when the poodle becomes emotionally synchronized with the entire household. Without realizing it, families start adjusting the emotional atmosphere of the home around the poodle. It happens gradually. So gradually that nobody notices the shift while it's happening. Voices become softer during tense conversations because the dog gets nervous when people argue. Certain routines become sacred because disruption creates visible anxiety. Someone stays home more often. Someone stops traveling. Someone avoids closing doors too suddenly because the dog reacts immediately. Tiny accommodations. Tiny emotional edits to daily life. And over time, the entire household starts orbiting the dog's emotional state. People begin monitoring reactions constantly. How is the dog acting today? Did something upset them? Why are they pacing? Why are they staring? Why won't they settle down? The emotional atmosphere of the house slowly becomes interconnected with the emotional stability of the poodle itself. And that creates something psychologists sometimes describe as emotional contagion. An anxious environment increases the dog's vigilance. A vigilant dog increases the household's awareness of tension, which then increases anxiety inside the environment again. The cycle feeds itself quietly, especially with highly intelligent breeds. Because intelligent dogs learn emotional patterns with frightening speed. Not manipulation in a calculated human sense, but reinforcement. If certain behaviors consistently reshape the environment around them, those behaviors strengthen naturally. A distressed look delays departures. Restlessness brings reassurance. Clinginess creates closeness. The dog learns emotional influence accidentally. And the family responds emotionally without even realizing they're being conditioned to. That's the contradiction at the center of living with deeply sensitive dogs. The smarter the dog becomes emotionally, the harder emotional boundaries become. Because intelligence creates responsiveness, but responsiveness also creates dependency. And dependency slowly erodes separation between the dog's emotional world and the human household surrounding it. Eventually, some owners notice something exhausting happening inside themselves. They are never fully relaxed anymore. Not because the dog is aggressive. Not because the dog is bad. But because the emotional attention never completely stops. There is always something to monitor. Something to regulate. Something to emotionally manage. And that constant awareness creates a quiet kind of fatigue people often feel ashamed to admit out loud. Because they genuinely love the dog. Deeply. Which is exactly why the exhaustion becomes so psychologically confusing. And eventually, some owners begin asking a question they feel guilty even thinking. Why do I feel emotionally trapped by a dog I love? Sometimes the problem isn't that the poodle is too needy. It's that they become too emotionally important. That's the part almost nobody wants to admit out loud. Because by this point, the relationship usually no longer revolves around simple companionship. The dog has become part of emotional stability itself. Part of routine. Part of stress relief. Part of recovery after difficult days. Sometimes, part of loneliness. And loneliness changes attachment in powerful ways. The more emotionally isolated a person feels, the more meaningful, constant emotional responsiveness becomes. A dog that always notices you, always follows you, always reacts to your emotions, can slowly become the most emotionally reliable presence in someone's life. Especially a highly intelligent, emotionally sensitive breed. Because poodles don't just receive affection. They reinforce emotional reliance. Every moment of sadness answered with closeness, every anxious night interrupted by silent companionship, every feeling witnessed without judgment, strengthens the attachment loop further. Until eventually, both sides stop functioning emotionally independent from the relationship itself. That's why boundaries start feeling strangely cruel. Closing a door feels cruel. Leaving the house feels cruel. Ignoring attention-seeking behavior feels cruel. Even emotional distance feels cruel, because the dog reacts to it immediately. And over time, owners begin experiencing something deeply confusing. Emotional claustrophobia created not by aggression, but by overconnection. By too much emotional synchronization. Too much attentiveness. Too little separation between the dog's emotional world and their own. And the hidden truth underneath all of it is uncomfortable. Extreme emotional attunement can become psychologically consuming. Not because the poodle is trapping you intentionally. They're responding to a bond that slowly stopped having boundaries. And that's what makes the final realization so emotionally difficult. Maybe the poodle was never asking to control your emotional life at all. Maybe they were simply doing what they were built to do. Connect. Stay close. Monitor the emotional world around them because closeness is how they feel safe inside it. Poodles mirror the emotional systems humans create around them. If the relationship becomes anxious, they become more vigilant. If the bond becomes emotionally fused, they attach harder. not manipulation. Reflection. And that changes the entire meaning of their behavior. The real problem was never affection. It was imbalance. Because healthy attachment needs something emotionally difficult for both humans and dogs. Space. Without it, even love can slowly become suffocating. Not only for the owner, but for the dog constantly carrying the emotional weight of another nervous system too. And once you realize that, their constant presence starts looking less like manipulation and more like fear of losing connection. The most emotionally overwhelming dogs are often the ones trying hardest to stay emotionally close. And maybe that's why life with a poodle can feel so emotionally intense. Late at night, long after the house goes quiet, many owners know the image well. The soft sound of paws in the hallway. The dog sitting silently in the dark, watching to make sure you're still there. Not controlling you. Not manipulating you. Just emotionally synchronized with you so deeply that distance itself starts feeling unsafe. That's the real story hidden underneath all of this. Emotional claustrophobia doesn't come from cruelty. It comes from connection without enough boundaries. And highly intelligent dogs amplify whatever emotional patterns humans build around them. So now I'm curious. Have you ever felt emotionally exhausted by a dog you deeply love? Especially a poodle? Share your experience in the comments. And if you enjoy psychological deep dives into dog behavior and the hidden emotional reality of living with different breeds, subscribe for more documentaries like this. Sometimes the dogs that love us most are the ones we forget to create emotional distance from.